theory. So I think that's kind of interesting.
Excellent. Okay, well, I think it's time to begin. I would like to welcome everyone, and in particular, our guest tonight, Jonathan Chapman, who is a professor at New York University in Abu Dhabi. Jonathan's fields are economic history, political economy, behavioral economics. He has a PhD from none less than Caltech, and his early degrees are from the University of Cambridge, not Cambridge, England, I guess, but Cambridge, Massachusetts. But another degree is from City University of London, which is UK, I believe. And the topic of his presentation tonight is decentralization and democratization in 19th-century England. So, Jonathan, the floor is yours, and I would like to remind everyone to please register yourself in the chat column of this seminar. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone, for coming, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to present. So this talk is actually going to be a combination of two different papers, both talking about this general question of decentralization and democratization in 19th century England. But before getting into the history, I just wanted to say that much of the motivation for this talk is actually more contemporary rather than 19th century. And sort of one of the big questions I'd like you to have in the back of your minds is that today we still see much of the world struggling to invest in sufficient sanitation infrastructure. So hundreds of millions of people lack access to clean water supply, billions of people lack access to sanitation. And this actually goes alongside mass democracy sometimes. So the world's biggest democracy, which is India, actually is in some sense the poster child for poor sanitation. It's the example that's often given in development. And so this might be surprising for a couple of reasons. The first is that actually people often suggest, well, to overcome some of these barriers to investment, what we should do is we should set up some decentralized system, particularly with locally elected councils, to overcome elite capture, to in some sense enable poor citizens to be able to push for the provision of these public goods. And it might also be a bit surprising because it kind of contrasts with this classic story in political economy, which is that democratic reform is associated with higher government spending. So one of the major theories in this area, which I'll be talking about today, or bringing some evidence to today, is this theory of Meltzer and Richard. And they argue that actually the bigger the gap between the median and the mean income in a society, or the median voter and the mean income in a society, the greater spending you'll get. So the more inequality you see, the higher spending will be by the government, in their case on redistribution. And when they look at this, so this leads to this follow-on that as you've enfranchised the poor, the median voter gets poorer, so you get higher government spending. This insight has then been incorporated into some models of democratization, so by Acemoglu and Robinson, also by Carlos Boix. And then we also see some empirical evidence of this from Peter Linder, who has shown that democratization also leads to greater spending on social spending by government. And then finally, there's another sort of influential paper by Lazzari and Persico, and they argue actually the franchise is extended in order to increase spending on public goods, to move spending away from corruption into sort of more productive investment. But the motivation for this paper and this study in that sense then is that I think there's some issues or some problems that we should still consider with this overall picture. So the first of these issues is theoretical, and the fact that most of these theories are focusing on redistributive spending. Redistributive spending, so high taxation, social transfers. This wasn't a major role of 19th century governments. 19th century governments generally invested in the army. Sometimes they invested, or they spent money on things like police. But this kind of spending on redistribution didn't really exist. And one of the reasons for this is that this kind of government activity really depends on having significant state capacity. That was limited in the 19th century, and in many ways it's probably still limited today. In many countries, limited today. Similarly, you can think that if we look at local governments, so often the bodies providing these goods, and this talk is in that part against decentralization, they're often restricted in exactly what they can do. So it's not the case that local governments can raise high progressive taxes and redistribute in general. So this means that these theories in some sense don't speak to some of the spending we might be really interested in, the sanitation infrastructure. And then the second issue I'd say with some of this work is that the demand for greater spending by the poor, particularly in the 19th century, is often assumed rather than demonstrated. And I mean that in two senses. The first being that actually there's often limited documentary evidence of what the poor actually want, particularly historically. But secondly, some of the sort of quantitative empirical studies that you see in political science and in economics actually show they use these mass democratizations as a way of testing the effect of democratic reform. This can be great. This can provide exogenous shocks. But one problem with this is that it means you're seeing huge swathes of the population enfranchised together. And that means you can't identify exactly who is pushing for greater spending on public goods. Finally, when we turn to some of these models like this Meltzer-Richard model, it's very hard to test empirically this idea that inequality mediates the effect of democratization. The reason for that being that it's very difficult to measure democratization across countries. It's very difficult to measure inequality consistently across countries. So it's very hard to test this effect empirically across countries using cross-country regressions. So the idea of sort of my work, or this part of my work, is really to use the experience of 19th century England to be able to test some of these theories and shed light on some of these questions. And to do so, I take advantage of the fact that local government in England and Wales was extremely fragmented. So in total, there was over 15,000 local bodies with wide range of responsibility. And this means that you get a lot of institutional variation, but within a common legal and cultural framework. And this, I think, provides some empirical context or a valuable context which we can test some of these political economy ideas. And in particular, what I'll be talking about is some variation in the level of democracy across place and across time. And in this talk, I'll be focusing on two different groups of authorities. So one of the many nice things about this context is different types of authority over different types of spending. So I can distinguish the effect on redistribution from public goods work. So the first set of authorities I'll be talking about are these what are called municipal boroughs. These are incorporated towns, and they provided urban public goods, of which I'll be talking about 150 of these. And by using variation, the level of the franchise in different towns to identify the effect on spending on public goods. And then the second set of bodies, these poor law unions, I'll be looking at will have responsibility providing poor relief, which is essentially social welfare. And I'll go into detail about what I mean about that later. So the story I'll be telling you is something like this. So you can think of the classic sort of story of democratization. Our empirical evidence, I think, is something along these lines. Well, we start with relatively small proportion of just the rich being enfranchised. As government spending on this axis, government spending is quite low. And then some of the work that I think you see these big jumps in the franchise, everyone's enfranchised and government spending has gone up.
Excuse me, Jonathan, can I interrupt you 1 second?
Yes, of course.
I don't know if it's only me or someone else, but I still see only the first screen, like the title, but I don't know if it's a problem with my screen or, I don't know, Leonid or someone, Timur, can you?
Same problem, I just see the title.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, same thing. We only see the title slide, Jonathan.
That is odd.
I thought that was intentional, but yeah, well, but it's probably about time to show us something else. Okay.
I don't think you missed anything. You missed some photos and then a lot of text. So I think the text is just what I said. So
yeah, when you were talking about the axis, I was okay. I guess there should be a slide showing that graph.
Thank you for jumping in. I had no idea. I think
right.
The internet freezes the screen sharing.
As they say in US airports, when you see something, say something.
Yes.
when you don't see something, also say something, right? So, okay, thanks. Good. Thanks.
Okay, no,
thanks for that.
Just finding the chat box again. Okay, thank you. So let me start this again. So here's this graph. So here I have the extent of the franchise on the x-axis, then government spending per capita on the y-axis. We start off with a situation where the rich have the right to vote, government spending is relatively low. And then we have this literature, which is maybe telling us that, well, everyone gets enfranchised, government spending goes up. This is where I got to. But then there's relatively little telling us that much about this middle portion, which is saying, like, well, what happens in the middle of this when only some of the population have the right to vote? So what I'll be showing you evidence of is that when we look at public goods in particular, the relationship looks something like this inverted U-shaped relationship. Whereas the middle class get the right to vote, government spending does go up, but as the poor get the right to vote, spending goes down again. So you get this actual increased opposition to spending on public goods. And I'll be arguing this is, or suggesting this is because the rich oppose spending because they pay a lot of tax. This is the sort of usual story. But then the poor oppose spending on public goods because they face these trade-offs with private consumption. So as an extreme, you could think of something like a starving citizen doesn't want to pay an extra unit of tax for public goods because they'd rather spend it on food. And so what I'll be doing is first I'll talk about the evidence showing you this story for public goods. Then I'll move on to some evidence for these councils who spend on redistribution to show you that the story is different when we look at redistribution. So that just repeats what I said. So we can start with this story about public goods expenditure. So to give you some background of the British experience, I'll now skip back into 19th century England. So if we think of the overall picture of sort of English parliamentary history, is in 1867, this very famous Second Reform Act gives the parliamentary vote to all male urban-headed households. And also after around this point, towns do start investing in some of these critical sanitation infrastructure, such as water supply, sewers, things like this. But you still get a lot of variation in the level of the spending across different towns. And even in 1900, you have some very poor sanitary conditions. So just as with this example I was talking about with India, that you see democratization doesn't purely go alongside this greater expenditure and investment in sanitation. So what I do in the paper is I take annual data for 150 towns in England and Wales between 1867 and 1900. So I'm going to have two dependent variables, the per capita spending on public goods and per capita tax revenue. And these are these town councils control public goods expenditure, but not redistribution, also not education. They really just control things like infrastructure and public services. And importantly, their taxation, so they had to fund these public goods themselves, and their taxation powers were limited to essentially proportional property taxes. And when I say property taxes, this means that it was collected from all occupiers. So it's not just a property tax on the owners of property, it's a tax on occupiers. So everyone is paying this tax in principle. And then these town councils were then elected under a municipal franchise. So is there a chat? Sorry. Who were elected under a municipal franchise, and this franchise varies a lot across towns. So that variation in the franchise is what I'll use to test the effects of democratization, and the identification is going to be based on the argument that the extent of the franchise is exogenous conditional on fixed effects and various control variables, notably the population growth, and people per house. So I'm sure you have more questions about the identification. I'll come back to some more evidence that this is exogenous later. So the reason for this variation in the extent of the municipal franchise is that there were important restrictions on who had the right to vote. So in principle, all male heads of household had the right to vote, but they only could do so if they actually paid taxes and if they met certain residence requirements. So at the beginning of my period, they had to have lived in a town for 3 years and have paid taxes for 2.5 years to be able to vote. There was also a lot of complication in exactly the legal definition of paying tax. So this gets a little bit sort of into the weeds, but the issue was that if you're a renter and you pay tax through their landlord, did that count as having the right to vote? So if you were very poor, it was expensive to collect taxes from you. As a result, what the tax collectors would do is they say like, well, you can pay the landlord then pays us. The problem with that system, was that legally it wasn't clear if that meant you paid the tax or not. This led to a lot of variation across different places because the law was simply unclear. People interpreted it differently, and in fact, this was an ongoing legal argument into the 1870s. However, over time, there's a lot of national reforms which both clarify the situation, but also simplify the situation by reducing the length of time you had to pay taxes and the length of time you had to be a resident. So the residence requirements, for instance, go from 3 years to 1 year. So this increases the franchise, and this effect of clarifying the treatment of these poor renters reduces the variation in the franchise a lot too. So in 1869, there's a set of reforms which were particularly large, and we'll see this in the data, and this standardizes the status of these poor renters and says everywhere they have the right to vote. And as I said, it reduces the length of residence and tax-paying requirements in the different cities. So my key independent variable will then cover the variation in this franchise. So I'll be using the male franchise so that we can carefully connect the extensions of the franchise to extensions in declining order of income. So if you remember, I said that it's people who didn't pay taxes, all these poor renters who get enfranchised over time. So I'm arguing that that implies that as the franchise is extended, this is enfranchising more and more poor voters. And I get this data from 7 cross-sections of returns to Parliament. And then from that, I interpolate between the different cross-sections and I estimate the male population using data from decennial censuses. I lag the franchise by 3 years to take account of the fact that elections happened over a 3-year period, but that isn't important to the result. So this is what the data looks like. You can see for each of these different towns over here, these municipal boroughs, I have the number of people present on the Burgess roll of the borough. And this is my data. I then divide that by the census population. So my main variable of interest then is the level of spending or the level of taxation per capita in these different towns. So I construct a new data set from annual municipal accounts. These are also reported to Parliament between 1867 and 1900. So then for each town, I have data on the tax and different types of spending. So I'll be looking at two types of spending. So first is total public goods expenditure per capita. I use this measure because at the beginning of my period, we can't break this down more precisely. But from 1872 onwards, I have data on the sanitation spending in particular. This sort of type of infrastructure we might be particularly interested in because of its importance to mortality. And that includes water supply, sewers, and this category, highways, watering, and scavenging. This basically includes street cleaning, street paving, and those type of measures. And then I adjust this expenditure data to account for one-off expenditures. So here's a picture showing you exactly what this variation in the franchise looks like for two different cross sections. So this blue line on the left, this pre-reform line, is at the beginning of my foot period. And this post-reform line is after these reforms in 1869 and 25. So you can see that in this pre-reform line, there's a lot of different variation, it's very wide. These reforms shift this to the right as they enfranchise these poor voters. And they also reduce the variation to a degree. And this is a result of standardizing the treatment of these voters across different towns. So this is the standardization effect. You can still see, though, there's still a lot of variation. And this is capturing both the characteristics of the towns, but also capturing the fact that it's still not clear exactly who has the right to vote because of some of this legal ambiguity that still exists. So I'll be looking at how this variation then affects the spending on these public goods and on taxation. And so the first way I can do that is just by using semi-parametric regressions and looking at what the shape of this relationship is. So what I'm doing here is plotting for each of these three dependent variables. I have on my x-axis the male franchise, the main variable, and then I'm essentially taking the spending, the revenue, and then the spending on sanitation, public goods per capita, and residualizing this to account for different dependent variables, year fixed effects, and town fixed effects too. So essentially this is plotting the relationship we see in the data. And you can see there's a very clear inverted U shape in each of these lines. So as the franchise changes, public goods expenditure per capita increases to around 50% of adult male population having the right to vote, then it declines again. So up to 80%, which is the maximum of the data, we see a decline in spending. Similarly with tax receipts per capita, we see this is around 45%, this maximum of this curve, and then it goes down again to around 80%. Sanitary spend per capita, remember, I only have this data from 1872 onwards, so I don't capture the full effect of these reforms, which I think why you don't see quite the same increase. But you see a similar effect in terms of a very clear decrease once we move past this turning point of around 40 to 50% of the adult male population. So in terms of the second thing we can notice about this is that these effects are quite large. So the way these graphs are constructed, the maximum of this line occurs at 100% of the median value in the data. So what this shows you is that as I move from the lowest franchise, the lowest level of the franchise in the data to this maximum, it's about that effect is around 40% of the median value. If I go down again, I lose about 20% of the median value. So these effects are quite large if we think about the full extent of the data here. You can see similar, not quite as big an effect in terms of the increase on tax receipts per capita. I think that's probably because some of this tax receipts wasn't as flexible in the sense of there were some things the towns had to provide. And then sanitary expenditure per capita, you can see this, I think the smaller increase is simply because I don't have as long a period to be able to identify this effect. And then you see this decrease again, a major decrease. The final thing I think I'd like you to say from this graph is just how robust this inverted U-shaped relationship is. So in the main specification here, I'm taking account of town and year fixed effects, also population growth. But then I can add in controls for occupation, different occupational structures in towns. I can account for the size of the tax base in different towns, so how much wealth so we can think of this as either just the wealth of the town in general, or as a proxy for exactly how much the government actually was able to raise through taxation. This is the value of property in the district. Again, you can see this doesn't really change the relationship. I can include population times decade fixed effects to account just for anything correlated with population and the size of towns that might be varying over time. And I can include a lag-dependent variable. This isn't entirely kosher, but you can see it doesn't really affect the results in any case. Now, this is all showing you some I think a very clear shape of the relationship. Of course, it's telling you nothing about the statistical significance or whether we should believe it. So to give you something more parametric, I also undertake some quadratic specifications, where this include a very standard fixed effect, two-way fixed effects panel data model, where I include franchise and the franchise squared. And then I have the level of tax receipts per capita or public goods expenditure per capita as my left-hand variable. So this is a very standard setup. I should say I use the quadratic model here for simplicity and because I think it's easy to interpret, but I also undertake some local polynomial regressions, some factory polynomial regressions, and they give very similar relationships. So what that does is allow the fractional polynomial approach actually chooses the polynomial that's the best fit to the data rather than imposing this quadratic shape and symmetry, and the results are very similar. Just to show you this table, so when we impose this quadratic relationship, these first 6 columns relate exactly to those graphs I showed you before. You can see in each case, there's clear evidence of this turning point, as you'd expect from the graphs. So around 50% for public goods expenditure, a bit lower for the tax receipts per capita, and around somewhere in the middle for the sanitation expenditure per capita. In each case, the variables are both individually and jointly very statistically significant. And they also pass a U-test of Linden, U-test, which is from Linden Mellem in 2010, which tests essentially that this turning point actually exists within the range of the data. It's not a statistical artifact. And these final 2 columns, I do something slightly different, where I actually impose a placebo test. And the placebo test I use is using property receipts. So this is the amount of revenue that the town councils raise from property in a district. And the argument here is that actually this is based on exogenous and historically held estates, and so it isn't actually open to variation from as a result of the franchise. And you can see there's no effect here whatsoever. The result is statistically insignificant, and if anything, it's in the wrong direction, which is why these are blanked out. So overall, this is showing you very clear evidence of this inverted U-relationship in the data. Now, I think what's most interesting about this is less the upward sloping part of this curve, which is interesting, but perhaps what's most novel or most surprising is the downward side of this curve. The idea that as you enfranchise the poor, actually spending goes down. Now, you might still be concerned. I've not really told you anything about who's actually being enfranchised here. I'm just using this percentage of people with the right to vote. So to talk to that question, I use these 1869 reforms as a sort of a difference in difference, and you implement a difference in difference approach to this a difference in difference approach to this question. And to do that, what I do is I use some data from 1866 on the income distribution of different towns and estimate which towns actually saw very poor voters being enfranchised and which towns didn't as a result of these reforms. So I then just have 2 different groups of towns, and I want to look at exactly who is getting the right to vote, and is it the very poor voters? And so again, here you can see there's a very clear graphical relationship, which shows you that as I enfranchise the share of poor voters in the electorate as a result of these exogenous national reforms, the level of public goods spending, the increase in public goods expenditure per capita is lower, and so is the increase in taxation per capita. So what this is saying is, if I enfranchise poor voters in 1869, over the next 10 to 15 years, actually I see lower growth in public goods expenditure and lower growth in taxation. And again, this is graphical, but I can do exactly this in a regression and see exactly the same results. So I'm happy to look at that later if anyone wants to see the regression results. But I think what—
Jonathan, I'm sorry, can I interrupt you for just 1 second, just to clarify? Poor are required to pay taxes irrespective of whether they're franchised or disenfranchised, or?
Sorry, I missed the beginning.
Yeah, is there any relation between taxation and representation? In other words, a poor person is required to pay taxes if she doesn't have the right to vote. So
yes.
So the liability to pay taxes is unrelated to the voting rights, right? So
no, yes. If you didn't pay your taxes, so everyone was expected to pay taxes, but if they didn't, they had the right to vote.
Okay, but if I do not vote, I'm not required to pay taxes, or am I? In other words,
Well,
because there
yes,
are two effects.
still,
If you extend the franchise, there are two effects.
Yeah.
One thing is that more people pay taxes,
Yeah.
and the other one is that more people participate in deciding the tax rate. So I'm wondering if both of these effects are involved here, or just one.
So just one. So the obligation to pay taxes is irrespective of your voting.
Is irrespective. Okay, thanks.
Your right to vote is dependent on actually having paid the tax.
All right, of course. Thanks.
Yeah. Okay, so we see these reforms. This is giving you more evidence that the poor oppose. It's actually really the poor that are opposing this spending, and that's what explains this second side, this part of the inverted U-relationship. And just to give you some qualitative evidence of this too, I found some data from a poll in Birmingham on this. When I say a poll, this is a referendum on increasing spending, essentially. And so in this poll, wealthier voters had more votes. And in that case, the average votes per person who actually wanted to increase spending was 2.4. For those opposing spending was 1.5. So this is giving you some very direct data that the people opposing spending in this one instance were relatively poor compared to those who wanted to increase spending. So just checking the time. So I won't go into this in a lot of detail, but one thing I do in the paper is, so far I've really just talked about the franchise as exogenous. I haven't really given you a lot of detail as to why, but I actually go and test that in the paper. And I do that by looking at some control of franchise decisions, exactly how these poor compounders, these poor renters are treated, and look at the decisions over who made those decisions, the decisions over how they were treated. And then I check whether those decisions were anyway related to the level of poor relief or the level of wealth of different towns. And I find they're not. So this is something I'm happy to go back to in the Q&A later, but in the interest of time, I'll skip past it. What I would like to talk about is just a simple model which can explain these results, because I think it's important in both setting up the intuition, trying to understand what this actually means, and also in terms of thinking about the next part of the talk. So we can actually explain this with a very straightforward setup, where I just have a utility function for different individuals, different voters, and they gain utility from consumption, and they gain utility from a public good per capita. So here I'm accounting for the fact that water supply isn't a non-rival. So this is a very standard utility function. In this case, government spending is funded by weekly progressive taxation and is paid by all citizens. So a proportional tax rate works here, but I then extended the results to forms of progressive taxation. Everybody is paying taxes, and the government only is only spending money on this public good. And I then assume that the poor have a very high marginal rate, very high marginal utility from consumption, or specifically that there's declining relative risk aversion over this utility function. And the way I think of this, or the way I think of it, is that they have a very high marginal utility from consumption because they're very poor. They'd rather spend this money on something like food. In the English case, probably better food. So I have some evidence of that. I can talk more about that. So more nutritious food, or better housing than they would on public goods. And I then impose a median, just have a very standard median voter setup with two candidates, and the franchise being extended first to the rich, then to the middle class, then to the poor. So the key sort of assumption here is this declining relative risk aversion assumption. And so with this setup, we can see people's ideal.
Jonathan, may I ask a question? There's substantial experimental literature and perhaps empirical literature looking at high order risk attitudes. So whether the third or fourth derivative of the utility function, if they're negative or positive. How does your assumption tie in with this literature?
So this assumption doesn't fit well with a lot of that evidence, but I would say a lot of that evidence is based on things like investors in developed countries. The one study I know which does try and look at this in a developing country, it does tie in with that. So I'm always open to more evidence of this, but it's a bit complicated because finance tends, most of the places this has been tested is in finance, and they're looking at stock market allocations in Western countries, which is not really this context. So I just know this one paper that looks at in developing countries where it does seem to meet this. I don't think that paper is entirely convincing. So if you know of other papers in this kind of context, I'd be really interested to hear about them. Does that address?
Okay, yes, okay.
Thank you. Okay, so I have a question here. Maybe the poor had worse education, understanding the necessity of sanitation. Yeah, so I'll get to that question in 1 second. I think it's on the next slide. So just to explain what this is giving us, this model is very simple. It's giving, with this assumption of the declining relative risk aversion, we're seeing that the ideal points of different voters are inverted U-shaped. Once we get that assumption, it's very straightforward to see that actually, when I start with just the rich enfranchised, we start with this tax rate, then you enfranchise the middle class, the tax rate gets up to here. Once everyone is enfranchised, the level of the optimal taxation falls again. So essentially what you're seeing is the poor opposing spending the rich opposing spending because of their high tax burden, the poor opposing it because of this high margin utility consumption. Now, to turn to this question from Dennis, do I see any evidence of this? So to try and get at this question is quite difficult because we don't have opinion polls in the 19th century, unfortunately. But to try and get at this, I look at both some historical literature and some modern literature about the 19th century, but also go and analyze political debates at the time to get to this question. So the question here is, maybe the poor just didn't have education, didn't understand sanitation. So I can say the first two things which sort of back up this model are first that, well, the working classes were relatively malnourished, they were very poor. So there's the study which goes and looks at their nutrition and says actually they were poor compared to rural India in the 1980s. So they did need better food. Second, the public goods that were provided were very beneficial in improving mortality. So it wasn't a case this money was being spent corruptly or something like this or wasted. So in practice, it was useful. That's not, of course, the same question as whether they understood it was useful. So to look at that, I go and carry out a study of debates in local elections in Liverpool, and also a set of referenda where people actually voted on these public goods, such as this example I talked about in Birmingham before. And what you see in these different debates is that the debates are really centered around the cost of providing public goods. So you don't really see anyone disputing that either the government should be involved in this, either because it's just not the government's role, some kind of libertarian argument, something like this. You also don't see people arguing that sanitary environments aren't important. It's always a question of the cost versus the benefits. And the real emphasis is like, this is just too expensive. It might be nice, but we can't afford it. It might be bad for business, things like this. Now, of course, cost benefit, you might worry that the benefit is still underestimated compared to the true amount. I can't prove that because we don't have votes on this. But I can tell you it's not a case of people just thinking it's a waste of time and it's not useful. People,
wait a second.
They didn't want to pay for them. Sorry.
Jonathan, but this spending might actually be a transfer from poor to the rich. It might be some kind of just a way to divert public money for private purposes. And then exactly if you increase the franchise, there should be less of that.
Yes. So I think that's why it's important that you do see evidence that this money is spent effectively overall. Like it does lead to reduced mortality. So, and it seems to lead to mortality which is reduced for different classes. That's so this is what the Zeri and Persigo and the Schretter and Mooney papers show, is that actually the benefits of the spending doesn't seem to be limited to just the wealthy, for instance, based on different neighborhoods of towns. The poor also benefit from the spending. What my paper here shows is actually the spending led to really big decreases in mortality from waterborne and even some airborne diseases. Now, of course, this doesn't show every single bit of spending was useful. Maybe there was also some money on top of that. But corruption is not part of the story of 19th century England. So I can just build to the history here that you don't see stories of officials making it off with, whatever the equivalent of hundreds of millions of pounds would be today. It's not the case that this is being siphoned off somewhere. I think the bigger concern would be that it's being spent on projects which are valuable to the wealthy and not to the poor. But I think what these debates show you is occasionally you see questions about this, but in general, that's not the case. I mean, these are really projects which are beneficial for the whole town if they work. Does that sort of answer the question?
Yes.
And the final thing that I often get asked about is, was this party political? And I think it's not party political in the sense that this isn't a question of national parties. National parties didn't really have a choice on this. And when you look at local level, sometimes you'd see the Liberal Party supporting greater spending. In other towns, you see the Tory Party. And really, this is kind of an attitude that cuts across party lines. It's not a party political issue in general. And it's not something really that the national parties are talking about for most of this period. So with that sort of part of the talk done, I think I have about 50 minutes left. I want to talk about a second paper, which I think also speaks to a similar question. Well, I'm going to look at the effects of democratization on spending on social welfare. So I've made this argument that suggested that the poor are opposing the spending on sanitation explicitly because they didn't want to pay for these public goods. Now that argument is specific to something like public goods, and it shouldn't extrapolate to something like redistributive spending, because if you think about redistribution, you don't have the same trade-off between private consumption and public consumption. And so in this sort of second paper in this part of the talk, we'll speak to that in a little bit more detail. So what I'm going to look at in this part of the talk is looking at provision of poor relief at a local level. So moving away from the town councils, I'm going to talk about a system of poor law unions. These are local authorities in rural areas that provided poor relief, which is essentially social insurance. And I'm then going to look at a reform to the governance of these poor law unions and see, well, did this democratic reform increase spending more in areas which had higher levels of inequality, as we would expect if we think about something like the Meltzer-Richard model. So some brief background into what the poor law was. So the poor law is a very broad range of social insurance. It provides payments to people who are destitute, which isn't well defined, but includes things like the unemployed, the temporarily sick, permanently disabled, old age, pregnant women, orphans, very famously, so this is Oliver Twist here, supported through the poor law. So a very wide range of people. Okay, so a question here, are intergovernment grants consistent through your analysis? So there's actually very little government grants in this period. I don't know if I said that very directly. So government grants are not a big part of the story. There are a few government grants. They're relatively small, and I control for them as control variables. I can talk about that in more detail, but really you can think of everywhere, all these local areas have to fund spending themselves. So there's a lot of historical background on the poor law that I'm not going to talk about. Just to give you some context, some of you may be familiar with the new poor law, which is in 1834. This is a very sort of salient moment where these parishes are grouped into poor law unions, and there's this emphasis on support in the workhouse. In practice, people don't all get support in the workhouse, and there's a lot of variation in policy across different places still. And so the overall picture of poor law spending looks something like this, that actually in the second half of the 19th century, you see a big decrease in spending on the poor law and the percentage of the population receiving poor relief. So this gray line is the percentage of population receiving poor relief, and these black lines tell you something about the total relief being provided, the total spending on social insurance per capita, and as a percentage of the tax base. So what you see in about 1870 is a real crackdown on the poor law. You see a lot of spending going down. Spending seems relatively low. Then in 1894, you see some democratic reforms, which I'm going to be talking about. And then you see increased spending again. So this democratic reform affects all poor law unions equally. So to carry out some kind of, as identification, what I do is I differentiate between towns of higher inequality, areas of higher inequality. And so the level of inequality is essentially the treatment. Now, each of these poor law unions was governed by something called the Guardians of the Poor. This is a locally elected council. These control expenditure on poor relief, not education and not public goods, which we've talked about before. And they had a lot of discretion over both how relief was provided, like in that workhouse or outside the workhouse, and how generous it was. Exactly, was it in kind? Was it monetary? How much did you get? All these questions were decided at the local level. The relief was funded out of local taxes again, and again, it was proportional. Now, these guardians were elected at the levels of parishes. So underlying each of these poor law unions, there was a number of parishes. And the electorate, again, consisted of all local taxpayers. The setup is very similar to town councils. However, there's one important difference, which is this. Sorry, I just lost my chat window. So if you have a question, please shout.
There is one question, Jonathan,
yes.
from Felipe.
Yes, I think I answered that. So,
you answered
yes,
that.
I saw that.
All right.
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Okay, good.
If not, please jump in, Philippe, and tell me. So the difference with this system is until 1894, actually, and this is the argument of Lazari and Persico that Leonard was asking me about earlier, is actually for these poor law unions, the wealthy have a lot more institutional protections. And in these unions, there's a graduated franchise with up to 12 votes for those owning and occupying large properties. So the poorest citizens only had 1 vote, the wealthiest up to 12. there was no secret ballot, there were very large property qualifications to act as a guardian, and there were these ex officio guardians who were justices of the peace, who were included on these boards of guardians as protection for county landowners. So these unelected representatives of the landowning elite. 1894, this essentially gets removed. So in the 1890s, you see this widespread democratization of local government institutions in England. And as part of this, these property qualifications are removed in 1893. And then the system of governance is democratized by the 1894 Local Government Act. And what happens? They remove this graduated franchise, they implement a secret ballot, and they remove these ex officio guardians. So at this point, we move from this relatively undemocratic system to a relatively democratic system. And that's going to be the event that I use to leverage the effect, or to look at the effects of this democratic reform varying according to the level of inequality in the district. So for this paper, I use a subset of a bigger data set of 630 poor law unions. I use unions which are rural, and the reason for this is it gives me some constancy over time. There's a lot of differences in providing poor law support in urban areas and rural areas, and so if you have places which are becoming more urban, that would complicate things. And then I link this to demographic and occupational data from the census. This is just the spending data. Let's skip this. And my main level of inequality is taken from the census. My main measure of inequality is taken from the census. And this is a little bit maybe counterintuitive, so I want to spend a moment on it. The way I measure inequality is I use data on the number of servants in households in these different poor law units. So in particular, what I do is I use 100% census data, so I can look at every household. And I treat a servant as a unit of wealth, essentially. And then I construct a top X% of servants measure. So this is exactly the same as you would see in inequality work, of saying the top X% of wealth in a society. I'm just doing that for servants. And in particular, I use the top 5% of servants. So what this is telling you is, what is the share of servants in the top 5% of households? So if I line up all my households from the household with the most servants to those with the least, i.e. 0, and I look at the top 5% of those servants, what share of all servants in those households? So very much like a standard wealth inequality measure. And you see this variation from around 40% to around 80%. So this is my inequality measure here. I then split this into terciles, so I have low, medium, and high inequality poor law units. And this is what the distribution looks like over different places. So hopefully you can see the shades here. So there's 3 groups of these poor law unions. So this whole map is England and Wales. There's about 630. The colored ones are the ones in my analysis. These darkest ones are the high inequality areas. The middle level ones are medium inequality, and the smaller ones are low inequality. Now, very strikingly, I think you can see there's a lot of geographical clustering here. So I do a lot of tests that this clustering is not driving the analysis. I can talk more about that, and I'll mention it a bit briefly later. But what I can do in particular is just chop bits of this out, and it doesn't change the results, essentially. Now, reason you might be worried about the geographic clustering, and it's one thing I'm trying to collect data on even today, is does this actually represent different types of crop, things like this? And that's something I'm collecting data on. But I can talk more about exactly what I know and what I don't know about that right now later, if you're interested. What is the pattern we see in these different poor law unions of spending? Well, I have I use two different measures of spending. I use this total relief per capita here, and the total relief as a percentage of the tax base over here. So again, this is the value of land. What is the amount of spending? And in both cases, you can see, again, this decrease up to about 1880, then a flat period. And then after 1890, in the 1890s, we see an increase. Now, this is very clear on both of these. I think it's easy to look at this graph. The story is similar, but it's a little bit easier to see. We see very little increase after the 1890s in these low inequality areas, but in both the medium and the high inequality areas, you do see an increase in spending. Now, you can also see something which might worry you is for the high inequality areas, there's some evidence of a pre-trend here. There's not for the medium inequality areas, so I have to do some tests for this, and I'll come to that. Hopefully I'll have time. How much time do I have left, Bernardo?
Like 6 minutes left.
Okay. Okay, thank you. So this is kind of the picture, in a sense, is what we'll be looking at. So first, very clearly, you can see some sort of straightforward results. Very clearly that actually there's greater increases in spending in these medium and high inequality areas after 1894, the year of this reform. So again, if we just look at the relief as a percentage of the tax base, you can see that both medium and high inequality areas have much higher spending post-1894 relative to low inequality areas. The point estimates are higher in high inequality areas, but actually they're relatively similar. You can't distinguish them from those in the low inequality, the medium inequality areas. It's really a gap between low and higher inequality in a sense. Now we can turn to this question of pre-trends. Here I'm looking at this middle tercile, these medium inequality poor law unions. And you can see, consistent with the earlier graph, there's very little evidence of pre-trends. You see this increase really takes off after 1894. If I count for district-specific time trends, this doesn't really affect the result. You see similar level of effects. So this is, for medium inequality areas, there's really no effect, no evidence of these pre-trends. High inequality areas, there is a little bit of evidence of pre-trend, which might not surprise you based on that previous graph. The control variables I include remove a lot of this, but not entirely. However, even then, if I control for district-specific time trends, the effect remains. It's still very strongly statistically significant and similar size. The other thing that's nice about controlling for these pre-trends is then I can try and distinguish between the immediate effect of these reforms from a sort of more ongoing effect. And so what you can see is that actually a lot of the effect increases slowly over time. And I think this is consistent with the idea that we change the governance. Over time, we see a push for higher spending. That's exactly what you see is that actually the effects, for instance, in medium inequality unions, you see some evidence of an initial increase in spending, but then the stronger effect is the slow increase in spending after 1894. I do a number of robustness tests, both about geographic clustering, differences in some samples. I limit the period as well. But very quickly, what I'd like to talk about is that we see this evidence that increase in spending is higher in more unequal areas, but this doesn't really tell us the reasons for this. So it doesn't tell us, is this because of a difference in median voter? You might be skeptical because this is kind of a wealth inequality measure. Is this more about political inequality? Maybe it's because we have some very powerful political sort of elites here. So to talk about this in more detail, I do a couple of different things. I actually construct a different measure of inequality by identifying where the gentry are within England and Wales. So identify location of great landowners and peers. And I also go and do some more qualitative analysis and look at actually, did the chairman and the vice chairman of these different unions change? So the last thing I'll show you, and I can talk more about other things in the Q&A if you have questions, is this table. So yeah, I'll come to the question in a second, David, thank you. Is just looking at percentage of servants in the top 5% of households here. So this is my main measure. What I also can then include is the median income of a farm laborer. Now this is only measured at county level, so it's not very exact, I should say. It doesn't vary across counties. So again, here I just take different terciles and construct the measure in exactly the same way as my servants measure. And I take the elite residents per acre. So again, I look at these elites in different areas and look at the number of residents per acre. So I have these different measures. So the first thing you can see is actually the median voter effect goes in the way we would expect in a Meltzer-Richard sense, which is we have a higher median voter, the effect on spending, a wealthier median voter, the effect on spending is lower after these reforms. So we see that effect. That persists even when I include my servants measure. So this is kind of consistent with a Meltzer-Richard argument, which is that we see as the elite gets richer, we see more spending, and as the median voter gets richer, we see less spending. So this is kind of what we'd expect in this kind of Meltzer-Richard world. On the other hand, we see less evidence that this kind of presence of the elites is really what's driving the results. So again, I conclude the servants measure and a measure of just how many elite residences you are. The servants measure clearly dominates this measure. This could be because the measure isn't perfect. But what you can also see is if I just look at whether you have a peer in these unions, like a lord of the realm, that doesn't have any effect on the level of spending. So there's nothing to do with just having a lord there or something like this. This does seem to be something about the level of wealth or the level of inequality in the district. So finally, just to answer this question from David. So the question is, what exactly are the servants I'm talking about here? Yes, sorry, I skipped over this quickly, I realized. So these are domestic servants. So I go through and try and strip out domestic versus agricultural servants. Because yes, if you just take the measure in ISEM, it includes farm servants and domestic servants. So I actually go through and look at some of the more individual categories to try and get rid of farm servants to deal with this potential issue. So I have some more to talk about, but I guess I'm out of time. So I can talk more about the qualitative elements of this if you're interested later. But just to wrap up then, so I think the conclusions I take from this are, well, extending the right to vote to the poor may lead to lower government spending, but this is dependent on government spending being on public goods. The poor are paying for provision, and they have a high value from private consumption. Once they extended this story to include redistributive spending, we don't see the same effect. We're seeing spending going up. So to go back to this overall question of, well, decentralization and democratization, I think the important thing to consider here is maybe not just do you democratize, it's like how do you overcome these issues that the poor might oppose spending. So we might worry about can the government subsidize the poor? They couldn't in 19th century England. The question that Felipe raised about intergovernmental transfers, maybe this is another way of sharing the burden across different places. And finally, just to bring back the connection to the story about India that I talked about earlier, there is some evidence, I think, in the political science literature that actually cost recovery, the insistence on making the poor pay for, say, water supply, for instance, is associated with political difficulties in modern developing countries because of the fact that some of these costs are very starkly regressive. So I'll stop there because I'm out of time, but I also have some more thoughts, which I can come back to with more time on exactly how the British government could have done better to overcome some of these questions. But thank you very much for listening. And of course, I'd love to hear your questions or thoughts. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks very much, Jonathan. We have time for questions and comments, please. Any feedback?
I have two technical questions and one comment. Jonathan, can you go back to the distribution graph of the cities or the towns? I think it was one of the first one. Yeah, I just wanted to.
This?
Yeah, yes, this one. So pre and post reform. So it seems like the post reform, although there was similar variation, that there was some kind of discontinuity around 40%, or is it just a statistical artifact? This is just a clarification for clarification question. And another question related to this is about possibility of heterogeneous effects. So with if variation was still quite high, even post reform in the distribution of franchise, probably you could observe some heterogeneous effects across different types of towns. Maybe a higher effect on towns which were mostly engaged in trade, and a lower effect for those who were mostly inland towns dependent on agriculture and so on. So that kind of question, are there any heterogeneous effects?
Okay, so the first question, I think, so this sort of discontinuity, this is largely statistical. I think, well, I don't know exactly what you mean, or how to define statistical. I think there's just one or two towns that are really low for reason, and they stay low throughout. Exactly why that is, I've never worked out, although I spent a lot of time trying to work it out for a while. So it's just that there's a couple of towns who stay down here, they slowly increase, but they never increase past 40%, and hence they stay very low. It's a bit strange, but I should say I can drop these kind of towns from the analysis. This isn't driving the results or anything like this, which I think the picture shows you later on too. Heterogeneous effects I've always really struggled with for two reasons. So the short answer is I don't have any heterogeneous effects to tell you about, but I'm not going to say there aren't. So I think the reasons I struggle with it is I don't quite know how to define a heterogeneous effect here when I'm thinking about the shape of this relationship. So any ideas are great. So one thing you could think about is, does it change exactly where this turning point is, in a sense? That would do with the wealth. That's a bit complicated because I don't know exactly this distribution. That's kind of how I ended up just looking at the shock of enfranchising the poor citizens. But the other problem is just that the data set isn't that large. So once I start splitting down 150 towns into groups of smaller towns, it's difficult to identify different effects. But did you have something specific in mind of exactly what I...
Well, by heterogeneous, I meant mostly like the power of the quadratic effect. So probably it was stronger in some towns compared to others.
So I think
the right tail on the U shape.
Yeah. So I think what you see, which is kind of So I mean, it speaks in a way, I think it kind of speaks to a strength of what I do and also maybe a weakness. So maybe I talk about the strength. No, I'm kidding. So I think what you see is, so what you see in different towns is some places, a lot of the poor are already enfranchised. That's kind of what this picture is telling you. And a lot of the poor are enfranchised, so you only see like this negative effect in a sense. You don't see the upward sloping part. And I think you don't see the upward sloping part because we just can't identify it because we can't see that across different towns. So I think that's what I like about this analysis. We can then literally see like, well, just as I enfranchise the poor, what happens? So I can speak to what happens to the poor. So that's the strength. The weaknesses, and what you might worry about, though I hopefully I can convince you otherwise, is I think that those towns, they're not randomly selected. So the towns that often tend to have a lot of the poor being enfranchised are places like, I think Manchester is like this, Liverpool is like this, places like this. Actually, no, not Liverpool, but a lot of these sort of northwestern towns are often like this, these sort of very commercial manufacturing towns. I think that's because they're relatively new towns is my explanation for that. So as newer towns tend to have less of these old legacies which shape the franchise. But that means that I can't then distinguish that from the effects of other things that you might be interested in, like some of the things you mentioned before. For that reason.
Okay, and Timur has a comment, right?
No, that's it. Thank you.
That's it. Okay, please. Anyone else? Any further questions and comments?
So there's a question in the chat window. Should I answer that?
Of course, please go ahead.
So this is about migration and T-row sorting. So I think there's two elements of this. I think in the poor law unions, migration is difficult because you kind of, well, is that true? People can't migrate for poor relief because that's not allowed. Essentially, you'd be moved back to where you came from, although this is complicated as a story, but you can't move as sort of welfare shopping. So you wouldn't be able to do that. There's this question of whether you could move to get urban public goods. I have never seen, I think in principle you could. I've never seen any evidence of it, but I think this speaks to this bigger thing that I struggle about, but I think just the literature struggles with it. It's very hard to know what the poor were doing or why they were doing it because they didn't write about it. But I don't think people talk about moving. There's not a sort of a claim that, well, if we put up taxes, people are going to leave. So in that sense, I don't see people worrying about that. So I'm not sure if it's at work, but I can't rule it out in that sense. So this is what's going on.
Good, thank you. Jonathan, I was trying to clarify your theoretical argument.
Yes.
Basically, my reading is what you're saying is that as you extend the franchise, the median voter gets poorer, right?
Yes.
And then the demand for what you call public goods depends on wealth or income or whatever in a nonlinear fashion. Is that correct?
Yes.
And as a result, you observe this inverted U. Well, in
Yes,
that regard, there is a paper that I think you might want to have a look at. Not sure if you know, but it's Apple and Romana called Public Provision of Private Goods.
Yes. Yes.
It probably rings a bell, right?
Yeah.
And much of the goods that you're discussing is actually what they call private goods. And that can be seen from in your utility function. You include the ratio of the public good finance per capita. So it's indications, kind of privately consumed public good. And basically what they argue, there are a couple of things that might be relevant for you, for your paper. The first one is that the preferred taxation rate depends on wealth in a nonlinear, mostly in a monotonic fashion, depending on the price elasticity and income elasticity of this private public good, right? And they distinguish between different types of public goods, in which case, in some of them you can observe increase of preferred tax rate in wealth and other decrease of preferred tax rate in wealth. And that depends on essentially how big is the income effect in relation to the price effect. And because you have data on different types of public goods, I guess you can make use of that. But secondly, and more importantly, because some of this private good consumption can be financed privately in addition to public provision, and you mentioned that, right? Cost recovery, this is what you had in mind. In that case, the relation between the preferred tax rate and wealth, in fact, would be U-shaped, inverted U-shaped, which kind of, which is similar to what you say, but in that case, also interestingly enough, the median voter is not necessarily the median income voter.
Yeah.
Because the coalitions for different tax rates could be disjoint, if you know what I mean. So I think you might want to discuss this. That might be useful for what you do.
Thank you.
And to perhaps clarify your theory a little bit,
Yeah,
better than you do now.
Yes, sure.
And you know the paper, I think it's 1996.
Yes, I think they have two papers,
private
one in the JP and one in JPUB. Maybe.
Oh yeah, they have a couple, you're right, yes.
Yeah,
right. Good.
I think, so I think the big difference, and so maybe this does, well, I would argue, so this doesn't come across necessarily well here, but
right.
The reason I think, well, I think there's two differences. I'm not convinced that with these public goods, the rich could opt out in a sense. They could buy them. So technically they could maybe pay for some of these things, but I think a lot of goods are about public health. And so I think, for example, if I remember correctly, it's a lot about education, therefore in Romano. And I think that quite applies here, that you need, you want everyone to be sick, to be well. So you don't want anyone to be sick because disease travels. I think, so I think that part, so that sort of is the element of the rich. And I think, yes, but yeah, so they're certainly linked. And I think this is something which it's in a sense, I can't prove which model is better, and they're very similar. So they're mainly just different emphases on exactly what we should worry about. I think in terms of explaining the 19th century, this is more helpful, but I think it's, I think that's one reason that I turn here to really thinking about what is going on with the sanitation public goods.
Yes.
I think this is trying to speak to which model is appropriate here. I don't think I talked about that specifically here.
And I also recall they make a reference to a paper, which I don't remember, which actually predicts what kind of demand for public good you can observe as a function of income, depending on different types of public goods. And they involve policing, recreations, public transit, and so on and so forth. I don't have it at my fingertips, but there are some indications as to what to expect.
Okay.
In fact, I can look it up, but you can easily do it yourself.
Yeah, now I'll go and have a look. I think the other thing that's interesting here, which isn't in those previous models, as far as I know, I mean, it's sort of a minor point, so I didn't talk about it here. I think it's interesting that a lot of these models are criticized because we talk about what's a proportional tax rate, but actually with this model, you can use, or with all of these models, probably you can increase it to a progressive tax rate. And I think that really is how we think about these things. Because I think it really emphasizes the fact that it's about the poor paying, not how much they pay. And I think that really matters in terms of how you think about the important structures. So sort of as a theoretical contribution, it's quite small, but I think it matters in terms of how we interpret the empirical results.
Good.
Thank you very much for the suggestion.
Right. Yeah, of course. Okay, well, let's see if there's any. Are there any further questions or comments? I don't see any. Okay, well, in that case, all I have to do is to thank Jonathan once again for presenting at our seminar.
Thank you very much.
And wish him good luck with the paper and with his stay in Moscow, of course.
Thank you.
And safe travel back to wherever he travels. And Bernardo, conventionally, please remind us what's coming up next in a week from now.
Yes, well, thank you, Jonathan, for your presentation. And I wish you a happy and safe stay, and hopefully not too cold the weeks that you have still in Moscow. So next week we have Martina Maggi from Ludwig Maximilians University in Munich. She will be presenting her paper on productivity distribution and firms rank the role of services. So next Thursday, same place, same time. So hope to see you all here once more. So thanks everyone for joining in our seminar.
Bye-bye. Thanks everyone. I'll see you in a week.